Welcome back, everybody. Today we get to learn about Bobby Kotick's breakup. Breakup with, obviously, Netease. Now, this was a pretty damn major thing. It's what's led to, say, World of Warcraft players in China not being able to play World of Warcraft, and that goes for all of the other Blizzard games. And it's a funny little thing where you think about the amount of people playing the game over there, and then Activision Blizzard would say, oh, it's barely commercially material to our financial results. A bit strange. And what's even stranger is part of this seems to be a mistranslation, right? Like, you know when a bad translation gets out and everyone reacts to it, and then you find out, oh, actually, no, that translation's not really how it is. Seems that may have actually happened in a Zoom call. It's very, very bizarre. So this is reporting from the New York Times that's basically giving us a bit of a look into the boardroom discussions between Activision and Netease, specifically a Zoom call in October that basically was the straw that broke the camel's back. And the overall deal here is that Netease wanted to ensure compliance with new laws in China by changing the terms of a contract that analysts say was worth $1 billion in annual revenue, which is quite a lot of dollars. Now, what's happened is that what the Netease executives contend was a conciliatory gesture that was actually seen as a threat by the Activision executives, and then a month later, they broke up talks, and the whole thing basically went up shit creek. It's really, really bizarre. Now, first, we've got to cover what led up to this call, apparently the call that sunk the entire deal. So essentially, there were new antitrust regulations around foreign capital, okay? And this spooked Netease a bit. So they wanted to have Activision comply more rigorously with these regulations by giving disclosures to regulators on annual revenue and business segment information. Now, the thing is that Activision already believed that they were in compliance and they didn't have to do anything more, right? They didn't have to do anything more than was needed. They didn't have to, go above and beyond to really ensure compliance, perhaps to allay the fears of maybe a bit of a spooked Netease. Okay, so per the New York Times, there's also some speculation that Netease may have been a little bit sneaky and may have been using this as somewhat of an excuse. So let's read this. Andrew Tang, a veteran gaming executive in China with close ties to Activision, said he thought Netease was simply using the antitrust regulations to get a better deal. Netease is under a lot of pressure the last couple of years because all these crackdowns and limiting kids' play, Mr. Tang said. Ultimately, I think it all has to do with the bottom line. Hardly a surprise. And if you want to understand that, if you're trying to make a bunch of money from video games in China, it's actually not all been smooth sailing. Even if you are a company like, say, Tencent, that, in other sectors is pretty closely aligned with, with the party and all of that. Basically, there are limitations on how much kids can actually play games. Of course, this is pretty bad if you're a games company, because what do you want to do? You want to get them hooked young, obviously. And quite a few other things, like licenses, like licensing stuff being suspended, and a whole bunch of stuff that's really sucked for the likes of Netease and Tencent. The thing is, this is not the only point of contention. The relationship may have been a lucrative one, but it was not a happy relationship all the time, apparently. Netease executives believed that Bobby Kotick, Activision's chief executive, had made unreasonable demands over the years, two of the people said. Okay, could you imagine doing business with Bobby Kotick? Maybe it's not going to be the best time in the universe. Though we have not had these explained any further, it does kind of fit the image that really has been built up of Bobby over the years, because it's not really just a bunch of execs from Netease saying this. Like, quite broadly speaking, Bobby's not exactly garnered the best public image for himself. But Netease have not always been perfect with Activision either. Here's a really good example. In 2018, Bobby was pretty unhappy because Netease pumped $100 million into Bungie. Now, at this time, Bungie, it wasn't an owned studio by Activision, of course, but Activision were publishing Destiny. They had some pretty lofty content expectations, so Bungie was behind schedule on all this Destiny content, and then Bobby's looking at Netease pumping $100 million into Bungie. He's probably thinking, oh shit, what's that for? Is this going to distract them from all of this Destiny content they're very behind on? So that's a bit of what's pissing off Bobby. Obviously, by the time we hit January 2019, they basically say, shag the whole thing. be gone. They do the split. And one of the reasons there is because Bungie were always behind in Destiny content. Again, I suppose you can think of the launch of Destiny 2, which is a bit of a shit show. Destiny 2's first 2 DLCs, not particularly in a fantastic position. But more importantly, in a way, Destiny was not a black box within Bungie. And it wasn't just that Bungie were being slow. It's that keeping Destiny going was eating up loads of Activision support studios. Obviously, those are support studios that need to be thrown into the Call of Duty meat grinder. In the same year, Bobby actually considered ending that partnership because Netease invested in a company founded by a person who had until recently been a senior Activision employee, which also angered Activision. So maybe not the best breakup with Bobby. Now, all of this stuff seems to have been hashed out and actually enshrined contractually. A 2019 deal between Activision and Netease included restrictions that prevented Netease from hiring former Activision employees or investing in gaming studios directed by them. So it's the idea here, let's say you're Activision. Do you want the idea of your ex-staff then being funded by one of your publishing partners to compete with you? I think from Netease's perspective, they just want to spread their investment tentacles out across the world, because obviously, if stuff's looking a little bit shaky in the home region, then you want to be invested in the US gaming market, the EU gaming market, all of that, maybe some emerging markets as well. You want that so that you're a bit more insulated against the local market going utterly tits up. But of course, Activision would have seen this as like, why are you hedging your bets? We're the bet. We're supposed to do well. This isn't good. There have been other things that have went bad. Obviously, there was a World of Warcraft project, a World of Warcraft mobile project that was under development for like 3 years. I think it was a team of over 100 people at Netease, and that was killed. It was actually a full MMORPG as well, which is pretty crazy. But let's get to the fateful call that scuppered the whole thing. Netease took all this context and they wanted to change the terms of the deal. Rather than a joint venture agreement, which is what had stood for 14 years, and had Blizzard license their games to a distinct Netease subsidiary, they wanted to license the games directly to Netease themselves. Okay, does that matter? Well, this would give Netease more control over operations and allow it to better comply with the new regulations without Activision's help. So essentially, they wanted to just take more stuff than the parent org so that they had more control over all of the stuff that basically applies to the local Chinese market. And then we come back to the call. Our named participants in this are Robert Kotick, also known as Bobby, the CEO of Activision Blizzard King, and William Ding, the chief executive of Netease, plus other executives on both sides, and then translators. And we should remember that all of this went through those translators. So Netease and Mr. Ding made this, made the proposal we just talked about. Mr. Kotick told Mr. Ding that he would consider the licensing proposal, even though he was worried that a switch could rattle Chinese regulators before an important political meeting that month and cede more control over Activision's intellectual property to Netease. So obviously, if you're Activision, you want to guard your IP very, very tightly. Now, as a part of this call, the impending acquisition of Microsoft came up, because obviously at this stage, all of the bad news came out about Activision Blizzard. Bobby was in a rough spot and the acquisition had been announced. This is unfortunately where things went a bit wrong for everybody involved, because the Activision executive said that Mr. Ding threatened Mr. Kotick. Right? Recall that Mr. Ding said Netease could sway the government to either block or support the deal, depending on the outcome of the licensing discussion, according to two people familiar with the call and a document reviewed by the New York Times. Now that's quite interesting, right? Pretty much just saying, Bobby, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to call my contacts in the American government and make sure you get killed in antitrust, or something along those lines. Which, I mean, if that was possible, that's certainly quite alarming. But per the New York Times' sources relating to the Netease side, this actually wasn't the intent. Apparently, they were trying to extend an olive branch. Basically, the point they intended to make was that if Activision could not switch to a licensing deal, Microsoft would face the same regulatory hurdles that they were in already when they acquired the company. So effectively a case of, we understand you're trying to get through this acquisition with as few regulatory hurdles as is possible. If you don't switch to the new licensing deal, there could be problems, right? Now, I suppose you could see how that could be seen as a threat. You could also see it as just saying, look, this regulatory shit, it's got to be dealt with. We either deal with it now, or then Microsoft has to deal with it as a part of the whole big merger, and maybe that would make things more complicated. Netease apparently then were putting the focus on basically saying, we understand this is a tough enough period for you to get through. But Activision were only hearing the there could be problems bit. So basically it is a classic case of miscommunications being possible. And I suppose it's also an interesting one. It's one of those things like, tone, body language, stuff like that. It's obviously a wee bit different across the world. I'm not really sure, like with Mandarin being a tonal language, American or British English not being a tonal language, I wonder if maybe there's some misreading of body language, or maybe the person who is doing the translating doesn't fully capture the intent of the executive, but you can obviously see how there's a lot of room for the bullshit to go on here. What is surprising to me, though, is that something that could be classed as miscommunication is enough to torpedo a deal like this. It's crazy. Now, Netease were actually willing to give a quote to the Times, but Microsoft were not. So, the Netease spokesman denied that Mr. Ding had threatened Activision. He said Activision was continuing to, quote, harass and taunt companies and regulators worldwide. And then this led to a previously reported counteroffer that caused even more issues. Activision would switch to a licensing agreement if Netease paid it roughly $500 million upfront, rather than in payments through the course of the deal, according to people familiar with the negotiations. And this was meant to insulate Activision from the risk that, its games could be tied up in a government approval process or be replicated without its consent. It's basically Activision saying, maybe we can do this, but I want the money up front. Whereas Netease are basically saying, this is commercially illogical. This isn't cool. Now, how could that be commercially illogical? Like, there's a lot of different ways. One example, if you are going to be paid $500,000 over 10 years, $500 million over 10 years. And obviously we're not talking about 10 years, whatever it is. You would always, generally speaking, rather have the money up front right now. Because number one, like $1 in $1 in 2020 money is worth more than $1 in 2030 money, especially with all of this inflation that's going on. Who knows? Maybe Bobby actually through all of this has a fucking inflationary time portal where he can just see inflation rates into the future. Who exactly knows? But obviously for Netease, this was not a particularly great deal at the time. This is still where we are seeing, intermittent success with Call of Duty. That's a bit up and down, but very up when it is up. And then Blizzard just running around in circles with all of its stuff going bad, right? So we're kind of still at that time. I mean, ish, Shadowlands a big disaster. We still hadn't really proven that the game would be better with Dragonflight, and even with that, Dragonflight didn't sell as well. But from the Netease side, basically, they're just like, hey, this makes no sense. Of course, the already set up contract was going to expire in January, and then what came next is basically things completely falling apart. The games get turned off in China, Netease handled refunds, and Netease staff just got their destruction gear and clobbered the shit out of a big Blizzard statue. Remember we heard some translations. I think was it the Blizzard? I forget who it was, but it was a decently important person who basically was talking about how, oh great, one asshole ruined the whole deal. And there seemed to be really quite a lot of very disgruntled sentiment coming from Team Netease. I mean, it was even on the stage. We were covering this story, and I mean, given fairly obvious things, there would, I think, especially with like 45, 50% of the audience watching from the States, or, generally being in a sphere of the world that is geopolitically decently aligned, there's perhaps a bias towards America and maybe a bias against against the Chinese side. It was quite interesting then looking through the comments. Everyone's just like, holy fuck, I can't believe I'm agreeing with Netease. This is insane. Obviously, this is all reporting. We do not know exactly what's happened. All we know is what the Times has been able to get out of their sources and feel comfortable publishing, which ultimately means that it does, come up with the credibility of the New York Times. Now, of course, the thing is, the Chinese business is something that Activision will want, right? They're not just going to go out of the country, so they will be wanting to get back into that region. They don't want to lose all that revenue. And we've talked about some potential partners, right? Because this is per GameLook. It was translated by Game World Observer. A Chinese insider and famous local WoW player, Dao Lao, provided context on the 4 companies that might be the people, where we've got Tencent, Perfect World, ByteDance, and Alibaba Group. Now, the New York Times also has information from 2 further sources that Activision has other names in the ring too, like China Mobile. So, obviously, stuff here could happen. We don't really know. I think most importantly, for legions and legions and legions of players of Blizzard games in China, who, pretty much like the same games that we do, they're completely shit out of luck, perhaps with characters that they've been playing in World of Warcraft for the best part of 20 years. And that really is going to suck. At the end of the day, we can view this all through a business and geopolitical lens. But they are actually, just WoW players like us, and they've had their game turned off. And that sucks. Right? That's really shitty. So what's going to happen for them? Well, apparently there's 6 different, potentially up to 6 different suitors. I imagine stuff's not went particularly far with some of these, maybe went further with others. But even while all that's important, well, the deal is still facing a few difficulties with the Federal Trade Commission. It's actually quite interesting. I always would have expected the EU and the UK to be, or maybe the EU anyway, to be a bit more aggro on this sort of thing than the FTC. But I'm assuming Lena Khan is still heading that up. If Lena Khan is sort of leading a more hawkish FTC, then perhaps they are a bit more willing to actually just tackle this kind of thing. But basically, they are still running into a few issues with their big merger with the FTC, even though the EU and the UK CMA actually do seem to be pushing towards acceptance and mild concessions. Overall, then, we just have a position where Activision, will it want to get bogged down in more regulatory oversight, more contracts the next few months, or would Bobby and co. rather just leave that to Team Xbox? Hard to say. But ultimately, who knows? Maybe some of Netease's words about, hey, this could be a problem in the future. Well, when the future comes, maybe it will be a problem. And if that is the case, then I suppose Mr. Ding can maybe have a bit of a chuckle to himself, but maybe also lament the probably likely quite value line of business that all of this was to the company that he works for. And there you go. That's the story. Supposedly, the story goes that people don't really like Bobby, and there is a miscommunication on a Zoom call, and that made the whole thing go tits up, which is a bit weird. And I suppose with that said, that's really it. I've ran out of document. I don't think the story's developed anymore, so I think it's time for us all to break. There's loads more news on the channel. I hope you found this one interesting. Honestly, I thought it was quite fun. There's a bit of a human element to this, right? Of people having misunderstandings and drama. I don't know. It's a bit of a good old juicy story. Certainly punctuated by people literally grabbing tools and demolishing a monument, demolishing a statue with brute force. Which, really was the cherry on top of that story. All right, take care, everybody. See you next time.